All right, thank you. Title of this paper is Buying Siberia, Fraud, Speculation, and Revolution from the Gilded Age to the American Claimant. Gregg Canfield points out that Twain's writing about money, finance, and economics are puzzling in many respects, one being that while other similarly minded authors, like Howells, gravitated towards social realism, Twain's typical mode of writing about financial fictions was to use some combination of burlesque, allegory, and melodrama. In my ongoing project on Mark Twain and money, I account for this generic melange by working from the basic premise that Twain's economic thinking has less to do with coherent ideas about political economy than with a quirky monetary imagination that is at the heart of his humor and creativity. Indeed, Canfield's observation is generalizable to the extent that I would say that most of Twain's major works and many of his minor ones use a mixture of burlesque, allegory, and melodrama. And I would further add a corollary to this axiom: money matters are often near the sites of generic transition in Twain's thought and composition. For this paper, I will discuss this idea in terms of Twain's most durable creation from his co-written novel with C.D. Warner, The Gilded Age, and that would be Colonel, Eshol, Beriah, and eventually Mulberry Sellers. If The Gilded Age has come down to us as a period of unbridled economic individualism, in Alan Trachtenberg's phrase, in which robber barons cornered market after market, then Colonel Sellers' hypertrophic scheming and speculative verbosity were performative of this identity in the Butlerian sense. And maybe in terms of Nate Wolf's presentation last night, a structure of monetary feeling. Even as most of his schemes came to ruin or are no more than beautifully concatenated breezes of speculative hot air. The drift of Colonel Sellers' monetary patter frequently contains the generic combination that Canfield recognized in Twain's writings on money. He is sort of a clearinghouse for these preoccupations. In working from this premise about Twain's monetary imagination, I'm not asserting that Twain's thinking about money and economics bears no relation to classical economic theory. But as with his essay on political economy, he is not a systematic enough thinker to sustain such lines of inquiry for very long, and he knows it. In fact, he suspects that neither are most people capable of such sustained analysis. And yet the culture demands that we act as economic agents. Thus, in this piece on political economy, the dutiful task of working through the classical economic theories is overridden by the impulses of conspicuous consumption of lightning rods and the electrical barrage that this leads to. I assume many of you are familiar with this piece. Twain concludes the essay in a generally fried condition. Let me just, my slides are a little bit out of order because I changed the thing. So here's the quote. I will remark here in passing that during that fearful time, I did not continue my essay on political economy. I'm not even yet settled enough in nerve and brain to resume it. To whom it may concern, parties having need of 3,211 feet of best quality zinc-plated spiral twist lightning rod stuff and 1,631 silver tip points, all in tolerable repair and, although much worn by use, still equal to any ordinary emergency, can hear of bargains by addressing the publisher. What began as an essay on political economy ends with the author taking a loss on a bad investment in 3,211 feet of lightning rod stuff. Indeed, the lightning rod is an apt allegorical figure for these transitions of genre: realism, burlesque, melodrama, and allegory all in one. As it is in its practical sense both a stock example of an object that is both prudent in the preservation of buildings, but also something of a con, trading on fear, and in its figurative senses, something that serves as a frequent target of criticism or focus of controversy, or something that diverts an attack from one target to another. That form of pivoting that we constantly see in Twain's humor. Underlying Twain's friction with classical economics lies his sense that it derives from the age of reason, and he was always interested in moments when the pretense of rationality is exposed to and by other psychologies, motives, and appetites. Rather than placing Twain in the context of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, or Karl Marx, as useful and illuminating as those comparisons are, I suggest that the behavioral economic theories of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, here's the book, since we're having a book cover theme going on, are perhaps the most relevant in a sense because they explore the biases of choice in relation to all kinds of behavior and psychological conditions. In Kahneman's terms, we might consider both Twain and Clemens, for there's considerable overlap in this regard between the historical personage and his authorial persona, as a mixture of fast and slow thinking, in which the cognitive self-consciousness of slow thinking is overridden by the immediacy of fast thinking desires. In turn, his characters frequently arrive at hard-won realizations derived from slow thinking processes. For example, all right then, I'll go to hell, and I tore it up. That coming after a long series of thoughts and this sort of performative notion there. With respect to money, if Twain wrote a kind of pornography of the dollar, as Justin Kaplan suggested, that is to say, by process of displacement, money plays the role of sex in his work. That's a quote from Kaplan. By which he meant that money was the topic that Twain fixated on the way a pyromaniac stares at a flame. We might modify this to suggest that Twain wrote about money with a deep awareness that it was emotional as well as rational, that it inspired fast thinking as well as slow thinking. We might also further consider that Kahneman's modalities of fast and slow thinking might correlate to narrative modes, to the genres that Canfield specifies: realism, burlesque, allegory, and melodrama. As Kahneman's behavioral economic theories focus on habits of thought, we can locate similar generic considerations throughout Twain's oeuvre, as in this example from the $30,000 Bequest, in which he discusses the relation between habit formation, the monetary imagination, and romance, which in Canfield's terms might be a mixture of melodrama and allegory. I think it's fair to make that kind of assessment. What miracles habit can do, and how quickly, how easily habits are acquired, both trifling habits and habits which profoundly change us. If by accident we wake at 2 a.m. a couple of nights in succession, we have need to be uneasy, for another repetition can turn the accident into a habit, and months of dallying with whiskey. This is sort of like 19th century Ambien cure that no doubt Clemens partook of. But we all know these commonplace facts. The castle building habit, the daydreaming habit, how it grows, what a luxury it becomes, how we fly to its enrichments at every idle moment, and how we revel in them, sleep our souls in them, intoxicate ourselves with their beguiling fantasies. Oh yes, and how soon and how easily our dream life and our material life become so intermingled and so fused together that we can't quite tell which is which anymore. When readers think of the more noticeable moments in Twain's work where the problem of romance reading, daydreaming, and fantasizing intrude upon reality, they tend to gravitate towards Tom Sawyer and his dime novel Walter Scott interventions at the end of Huckleberry Finn, or those passages in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer where he insists on making those around him act out romantic or heroic scenarios. These moments are often problematic because they are never entirely stable in terms of its aesthetic distance in Twain's work. It can often be unclear where the author's investment in wish fulfillment ends and his character's investments begin. This passage from the $30,000 Bequest serves more as a meta-commentary on the problem of imposing one's fantasies on reality, but it is complicated by the idea that the romantic has been subsumed as an explicitly monetary fantasy. Rather than the imposition of a chivalric or quixotic fantasy on reality, The fantasy is about money and the accumulation of capital and wealth and property. Rather than tilting at windmills, the couple in the story, Alec and Sally Foster, turn the accumulation of a paper fortune into a romantic quest. If money is inevitably part of the bedrock of reality, then this passage takes us back to the very problems of the Gilded Age and how the practical aspects of money can be inflated into fantastic proportions, scaled up to levels of wealth and empire that start to resemble fairy tales about castles and kings. There's also an element of political commentary here that has to do with identity and money, where one sees oneself in the greater middle class, as it were, and how the monetary imagination can tear at the fabric of democratic society. In the Gilded Age, Twain and his co-author Warner were interested in criticizing the speculative aspects of American culture and how that would impact or corrupt the courts, Congress, and the lives of individuals also participating in those shared forms of collective and private speculation. Part of Twain's point that has been generally overlooked with this story is that money and investment can become the engine of romance for the middle class of the late 19th century America. In the $30,000 bequest, the Fosters had become wholly speculative creatures where their romantic and romance reading habits have been taken over by an obsession with speculative investment to the point that they no longer look at their actual circumstances and understand them as such, but see them through the lens of a visual futurity in terms of that paper fortune that they've been co-imagining. The Fosters of the $30,000 bequest are doubly relevant because they are, in essence, a marital version of the dynamic between Colonel Sellers and Washington Hawkins, with the wife playing the part of Sellers and the husband playing the part of Hawkins. They intoxicate each other with their talk of paper investments, taking over their fantasy lives and leading to the ruin of their marital intimacy, which coincides with the demise of the paper fortune and ultimately their deaths. Sellers is a character that Harry Wonham has aptly described as specializing in not only in far-fetched land development schemes, but also in the cultivation of a very different kind of phantom wealth, a kind that exists strictly on paper. Indeed, Colonel Sellers melds literary paper and paper currency. And I might extend Wonham's meaning in one more dimension, in the extension of speculative language into a form of literary currency. As a form of paper currency, Colonel Sellers produces a range of similar types of social effects, and he achieves them largely through his incessant patter. From the outset, central to his personality is that indestructible optimism that is seemingly impervious to any setback, no matter how ruinous. Daniel Kahneman uses his two systems of thinking, fast and slow, primarily to show where error and bias arise in economic behavior, many features of which resonate with Twain's monetary imagination and Clemens's investment history. But the element that is most relevant to Colonel Sellers is what Kahneman terms optimism bias. Kahneman suggests that this, quote, may well be the most significant of the cognitive biases, in that it fosters the illusion that we have substantial control of our lives and we tend to underestimate our exposure to risk and overestimate the benefits of any given venture. Furthermore, Sellers possesses the verbal legerdemain to create quasi-scientific or medical rationalizations for his economizing measures when facing straitened circumstances. When the family has no fuel to heat the house, he claims that French medical journals have discovered that all one needs is the light from a candle with the heat without the heat in order to prevent rheumatism, even though it is apparent to even his most credulous audience that the house and its inhabitants are frigid. As a corollary to this, his talk about the meager fare at his table convinces the hearer that they're eating a sumptuous feast or delicacies of a high order. According to the text, the colonel's tongue was a magician's wand that turned dried apples into figs and water into wine as easily as it could change a hovel into a palace and present poverty into imminent future riches. In a sense, it is unfortunate that this famous description lumps all of these effects together, as if they were all the same rhetorical effect, or that they required the same forms of social consent. For if the text is to be taken at its word, Sellers' table talk does seem in actuality to improve the experience of dining, to make dishwater coffee, or Rio coffee as he calls it there, seem not only palatable, but actually good in the act of deeming it good and savoring it accordingly. Is Twain suggesting through Sellers that the palate is just as susceptible to imaginative suggestion? I would say yes, perhaps so, but it's more important to recognize that these rhetorical modes are distinct. To be taken in by giddy investment talk implies a kind of realism. We can all be hoodwinked by a good scam on that level. To see a hovel as a palace could be a burlesque or some form of extreme sentimentality. But to view the unpalatable as delicious is surreal and delusional. As many scholars such as Wonham, Matt, Seibold, Sharon McCoy, and I think obviously Nate, have observed, in tracking the evolution of Colonel Sellers, we can gauge the development of Twain's shifting socioeconomic perspectives, especially the extent to which he distances or aligns himself with the capitalist frenzy he writes about. I would also argue that Sellers becomes a bellwether for Twain's monetary imagination with respect to genre. He is not only a speculator, but a vehicle of what we might call speculative fictions. If we trace his character arc from the creation in the 1870s through the stage versions with John T. Raymond, that's Colonel Sellers, the stage collaboration with William Dean Howells, Colonel Sellers' Scientist, to his apotheosis in The American Claimant, 1892, a pattern within this pattern emerges that my title hopes to suggest, from fraud and graft toward global revolution. When we first learn of Colonel Sellers' speculations in the Gilded Age, he has been trafficking in human chattel with a scheme to increase their value by transporting them from the mid-Atlantic states to the deep south with the intent of gaming state laws. He is also dabbling in perpetual motion machines, an explosive petroleum lantern, raising mules, and speculating on the sugar market. The scale of his activities is comparatively modest. There are his petty grifts in which he gets Philip and other would-be investors to pay for drinks, etc. But in fairly short order, his investment schemes start to scale up. With the Rothschild proposition, a scheme to leverage 113 wildcat banks all over the western United States, he has gone national. And with the inflatable imperial oriental optic lineament and salvation for sore eyes, it's so great, isn't it? I mean, in a sense, the name of the product is in microcosm the beauty of his pattern. It's just long enough to be unwieldy, and Matt, your image of him putting together the dinner table network seemed to me so resonant of that's exactly what is going on with him, that ability to sort of stem wind it out to impossible lengths, blowing bubbles, as the phrase is. So he, at that point, with this salvation, Sellers' imagination is truly international and global. We have a sense of transnational capital flowing across more than state lines, frontiers, and borders, but oceans and continents. And the purpose of these investments seems to be nothing more than the accumulation of capital for capital's sake, or perhaps a kind of impenetrable cushion or safety net. In as a sense, he is talking a system of global capital into being. The slogan of the Gilded Age and the plays that followed that would come out to be Sellers' catchphrase, "There's millions in it." That seems to be all there is to say about it. It is a discourse of easy pickings, or as Wonham has suggested, capital's ability to effortlessly reproduce. By the time of The American Claimant in the 1890s, millions have become billions, as Sellers tells Hawkins, and another crucial element has been introduced into his calculations. The accumulation of massive capital must have a political rationale. It can no longer be an individual end in itself. as Twain conceived of the astronomical sums that circulate within modern economies, as I explored in my work on the million-pound banknote, he contemplates the individual desire for massive accumulation of capital in terms of ideological projects. As Sellers explains in the American Claimant, if you wanted 10 millions, I could understand that. It's inside the human limits. But billions, that's clear outside the limits. There must be a definite project back of that somewhere. That is to say, Twain's speculative maniac has come finally to the place where he finds the limits of his own greed within his own worldview and the economies of scale that shape it. That project is, of course, buying Siberia in the name of democracy. When we encounter him at the beginning of the American Claimant, he is surrounded by a series of claims. He's fat, and here's the image that's in the text here. I guess they've given him hair for this one. He is fashioning the 19th century Victorian equivalent of the Rubik's Cube in his study, a puzzle called Pigs in the Clover, that he will sell cheap only to see it become a nationwide fad. On the wall hangs his lineage, obsessive claim to the title of British nobility, and on the opposite wall, which we cannot see, he has hung a map of Czarist Russia that is his geographic spatialization of his, to that point, largest speculative fantasy, to buy Siberia in the name of democracy, in imitation of William H. Seward's acquisition of Alaska in the late 1860s. And here is the text of that one. On the opposite wall was another map, and this was the most imposing decoration of the establishment and the first to catch a stranger's attention because of its great size. It had once borne simply the title Siberia, but now the word future has been written in front of that word. There were other additions in red ink, many cities with great populations set down, scattered over the vast country at points where neither cities nor populations exist today. One of these cities, with the population of 1.5 million, bore the name of Liberty Orlov-Zolinsky, and the other was still more populous one, centrally located in Mark capital, which bore the name Freedomolova Ivanovyevich. Yeah, my Russian's okay. The names of the towns are gross Russifications of American democratic cant words, like freedom and liberty. And deploying the central pun of the book, Matt, you made the same point last night, a notion of the city that is for the present called capital. As if the ultimate dream now were to convert free-flowing global capital into a capital city. So there is Sellers at the beginning of the novel, surrounded by his hobby horses, claims on the past, present, and future, your residual dominant and emergent, if we might put it that way, each with a claim on genre, romance, realism, burlesque. Twain has also introduced into this triangulation a triangulation of genre, a deeper question of, or even crisis of agency. As Matt Seibel has observed, in earlier works, readers were left to guess or wonder whether the Colonel's speculations were made in earnest or willfully fraudulent. In The American Claimant, there can be no doubt Sellers believes his own bullshit. It's a great quote, Matt. Sorry for swearing, but there it is. It's worth it. The notion that fraud might slip easily into delusion is an important one, and I would even argue a hard-won insight, especially for realism. And this certainly speaks to our own moment and to the Gilded Age. If the background story for The American Claimant has to do with one branch of Clemens' family having ties to titled English aristocracy, and Clemens' interest in the Tichborne claimant case that absorbed England in the 1870s, then we can fairly safely conclude that what ties all of these interests together is both a personal and transpersonal social concern for the way that lies might reveal a larger truth. Just with the Tichborne claimant and Zadie Smith's book about that, where she's almost thinking through the O.J. trial and the way that the lie that O.J. is not guilty basically gets to the larger truth of the social structural injustices. Twain is deeply interested in that kind of a formation, and he never, it's there, of course, most saliently as Huckleberry Finn, but it's there a lot of times and in a lot of different ways. So democratization has frequently been part of the imperial and corporate rationale for invasion, takeover, and colonization. And Twain seems to be putting his finger on that, and yet is not quite willing to offer a full-throated criticism of it, because somehow the monetary imagination is rooted in the value of such operations in paper and literary currency. Mark Twain and money are fascinating, not merely because he wrote a lot about money, and he also lived a life full of financial incidents, ups and downs, and obsessions, but also because financial speculation and authorship are in a fundamental way opposing conditions. Authorship as storytelling is a form of hindsight. The author is the god of his fictional world, or at least at some point in the creative process, the one who knows how the story will turn out and writes in the direction of that knowledge. Money matters are, in general, a wager, a form of uncertainty, and we, as the investors or transactors, are the authors of uncertainty. We hazard, we wager, we risk, we venture. Both involve fast and slow thinking. I've written elsewhere that Twain's central relation to money moves from venture to adventure. After a fashion, Colonel Sellers functions as a character who allows this equation to run in both directions, forward and reverse. Taken as a whole, varied exploits, both real and imagined, string together like a series of adventures in which he manages to emerge with his speculative optimism undiminished. And yet, the cultural work of his ceaseless chatter is to convert adventure back into venture, or as it happens, an infinite series of ventures, until in the end, he becomes little more than an inventory of global venture. His valedictory venture being to melt the Arctic poles. Let's see, where is it? Here we have the text there. His valedictory venture being to melt the Arctic pole and convert it into a resort to control the climates of the globe on demand for order for commercial purposes. The image of climate change that oddly echoes our present global crisis is the kiss he throws to us, his love sign, as he calls it. And just like the family, just like his family and his family relations and his friends, we are made to endure the love of the Colonel, and maybe this is what it ultimately means, to be loved by Colonel Sellers. Thank you.